Hello, everybody. Today, my team and I are going to talk about our research study, which was about are there more men or women driving, and is it different for different types of vehicle?
In order to create our statistical study, the data collection methodology used in our project to conduct this observational study was a cluster sampling, where we had 5 out of 15 different combinations of days and time interval were randomly chosen in order to observe and record the cluster of drivers passing by an intersection during the selected date and time interval. To answer a research question which was mentioned earlier in the presentation, our target population were men and women drivers of Montreal and Quebec cities, which is where we put in place the variable x is equal to 0 to categorize men and x is equal to 1 when it is a woman. With these variables in place, me and my 4 other team members went out and collected data during the first 2 weeks of February in order to find a proper representation of the population of Montreal and Quebec City. We found the proposed sample size by using a formula which was found to be 385 units. In our sample, we collected 204 data from Montreal and 200 from Quebec City in order to continue with our research.
In order to realize our study research, we carried out two different tests. The first one was to compare the proportion of male and female drivers in Montreal and in Quebec City. This test concerns the comparison of one proportion as a one-cell test since the proportions are dependent. For the second test, the proportion of female drivers in Montreal was compared to the proportion of female drivers in Quebec City. This test concerns the comparison of two proportions of independent cases as a two-cell test since there are two independent populations. As you can see in the table, the parameters under study are proportion of female drivers in both cities studied and the proportion of male drivers as well. At the 5% significance level, since the p-value is greater at 8.16%, the collected data does not support the claim stating that the proportion of female drivers is statistically lower than the proportion of male drivers. It is also good to note that in our Montreal sample there were 90 women and 114 men. In our Quebec sample there were 98 women and 102 men, the most common car brands being Toyota and Honda in both cities studied. There was a total of 204 observations in Montreal and 200 in Quebec City.
So for the test number two, the parameters under study were the proportion of female drivers in Montreal and the proportion of male drivers in Quebec City. For the results of test number two, we found a p-value of 33.53%, which is greater than the significance level, which was set at 5%. Consequently, at a 5% significance level, the collected data does not suggest a difference between the proportion of female drivers in Montreal and in Quebec City. The later conclusion agrees with the calculated confidence interval, which includes the value of 0, thus suggesting that the difference in these proportions could be equal to 0.
Different limitations were found, but one example of them would be that different regions of Montreal and Quebec City have a greater or lower traffic flow depending on the time of the day and the day of the week. These limitations did impact our study. In fact, since we only consider Class 5 drivers, the results obtained are not exactly representative of the entire populations of drivers in Montreal and Quebec City. For instance, trucks might be more driven by men, which in that case would change our result. There are some limitations due to the pandemic. For example, since school for young adults is done online, there could have been less of that age group in our sample. The same can be said about adults because most of them work from home. However, even if the same can be said about seniors, they are the age group that is the most impacted by the pandemic and are the ones that are the least seen outside. Thus, the numbers of elderly seen might have been affected the most due to the virus. In conclusion, we can say that at a significance level of 5%, the results of the study do not support the assumption claiming that the proportion of female drivers is statistically lower than the proportion of male drivers in Montreal and in Quebec City. Additionally, the collected data does not support the claim stating that the proportion of female drivers in Montreal is statistically different from the proportion of female drivers in Quebec City. Thirdly, the study also revealed that both genders prefer driving the car brand Toyota in Montreal, while both genders prefer driving the car brand Honda in Quebec City.